"Kiss me once before the ceremony," whispered the Alpha King. What the Omega did took his breath away. The castle stood like a shadow over the valley, its black stone walls absorbing the last rays of the dying sun. The wind whispered through the towers, carrying secrets that no living soul dared speak aloud. Within those walls, power was absolute and fear was law. The Alpha King reigned not only through command, but through the weight of legend. Many had tried to see him as human, as vulnerable, but none had succeeded. His presence alone could silence a room, and his eyes could make the strongest warrior kneel without a single word. Tonight, however, even his legendary composure felt fragile. Something new had arrived at the castle, something that did not bow, did not flinch, and yet held a quiet, unspoken power of its own. The Omega girl had been brought to the castle at dawn, escorted through the twisting corridors and glittering halls by guards who whispered her fate in hushed tones. She did not speak. She did not complain. Even the softest whimper of fear did not escape her lips. The court watched her carefully, expecting trembling hands, lowered eyes, and the kind of obedience that would prove her worthiness. But what they saw instead was stillness, calm, defiance beneath her quiet. The Alpha King observed from his throne, a dark figure against the fading light. His gaze was drawn to her immediately. He expected fear. He expected hesitation. What he did not expect was curiosity, the faint, almost imperceptible spark of it in her eyes. Her arrival had been ceremonial, the beginning of a bond that would mark her life forever. The ceremony was not mere tradition, it was law. It was a declaration of dominance, of claim. The Omega was expected to submit, to give herself entirely to the Alpha, and in return to be protected. But from the moment she entered the Great Hall, she had refused the rules without saying a single word. The Alpha King leaned forward slightly on his throne, the edge of his black cloak brushing the floor. His voice, low and measured, carried across the hall. "Approach!" The girl did not flinch. She did not rush, nor did she hesitate. She walked steadily, her bare feet making no sound against the stone floor until she stood before him. He looked down at her, expecting to see the shadow of fear, the trembling of someone who knew their life was no longer their own. But he found something different, a steady, unyielding presence like a candle burning against the storm. He studied her face. Her eyes held stories he could not yet read. Her lips were pressed in a line of composure, but he could sense the life beneath the surface, the strength she carried despite her circumstances. A strange feeling stirred within him, something unfamiliar and unsettling. "You are bound to me now," he said, his voice a soft growl echoing slightly in the vast hall. "Your life belongs to the crown, to me. Understand." She inclined her head, but not in submission. It was a simple, measured gesture, almost as if acknowledging a fact she could not change, but not as one who feared it. The room fell silent, sensing the tension between them, a current that neither could fully name. The Alpha King rose from his throne and descended the steps, his boots clicking against the stone. He stopped a few paces from her, the air thick with the scent of iron and candle smoke. "Tomorrow, the ceremony will bind you fully. Tonight, you are mine to command." Her gaze met his. There was no fear, no pleading, only clarity. And in that clarity he felt something shift, a spark that was neither obedience nor challenge, but understanding. That night the castle seemed to hold its breath. She was escorted to a private chamber, a room lined with tapestries depicting past rulers, past bonds, and past Omega sacrifices. The walls were cold, but the fire in the hearth gave the room a soft glow. She stood in the center of the room, her posture calm, yet wary. The Alpha King entered after her, moving quietly, almost as if he were intruding on something sacred. He did not sit, did not command. Instead, he observed. The shadows in the room seemed to lean toward him, and yet in the warmth of the fire he did not look like a king. He looked human. "You fear me," he said finally, his voice low. "I can see it even in your stillness." She tilted her head slightly, almost smiling, but it was a faint, fleeting expression. "I do not fear you," she said softly. "I do not serve fear." His eyes narrowed, not in anger but in fascination. No one had ever spoken like that to him, not in centuries, not when he was at the height of his power, the master of all who bowed and knelt. There was a rhythm to her voice, a calm that did not demand attention yet drew it inescapably. "Tomorrow, the bond will be complete," he said, "and you will have no choice. You will belong to me." "I belong to myself," she replied, her voice steady, carrying the weight of her past, her exile, and her silent endurance. He felt a strange twist in his chest, a tension he had not known in years. He had ruled with iron and shadow, feared by all. But this was something different, something alive, something that challenged him in ways no one ever had. "Then kiss me," he whispered, stepping closer. "Once before the ceremony, just once, and I will let the night pass without claiming more." Her eyes widened slightly, not in fear but in contemplation. He expected obedience, a kiss offered quietly to placate him, to ease the tension. But she did something he could never have predicted. She did not move her lips toward his. Instead, she reached forward slowly, placing her hand over his chest, right over the heart that beat behind armor of darkness and curse. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening, almost feeling the weight he carried, not as a king, but as a man. The Alpha King froze. The fire in the hearth flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, and for a single moment the air between them was charged with something electric, fragile, and terrifying. The bond of power was there, yes, but it was not what he had expected, not submission, not fear. Something else entirely. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly against his chest, her breath warm against his armor. He could feel the pulse of life beneath his fingers, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, steady, unyielding. And in that simple act, he felt something awaken, a memory, a curse, a longing buried beneath centuries of command and solitude. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not know what to do. His hands itched to grasp, to claim, to assert the power he had always held over life and death. But he did not move. He could not, because in that small, quiet gesture she had taken more than a kiss could ever give. She had taken something deeper, something he had hidden even from himself. The night stretched on. Neither spoke, but neither moved. The fire crackled, the wind moaned against the stone walls, and somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a bell told the hour. Time seemed suspended, caught between expectation and possibility. Finally, she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear there, no apology, only a quiet strength, a knowledge that she had chosen how to give herself, not to him, not to the law, but to herself. The Alpha King felt a shiver run down his spine. For centuries, he had believed himself untouchable. That night, he realized he had been wrong. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice softer than he had intended, almost a whisper. "Tomorrow, everything changes." She inclined her head, and in that small motion, she spoke volumes. She would face whatever was coming, not with fear, not with obedience, but with the quiet defiance that made him question everything he had ever known about power, desire, and the heart of a king. And as she turned to leave the room, he knew one thing with certainty. No bond, no ceremony, and no law could contain her. For the first time in centuries, he felt human. The castle slept that night under the weight of something ancient and new. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and stone, of forests and distant mountains. Inside, a heart that had never known warmth now throbbed with something dangerous, hope. And in the quiet, the Alpha King whispered to himself, "Kiss me once, and you do not." A statement of challenge, a confession, a beginning. The night waited, and so did the bond. The sun rose slowly over the mountains, its pale light brushing the black stone towers of the castle with gold. Within the great halls, life went on as if nothing had changed. Yet beneath the surface, tension hummed like a hidden drumbeat. The ceremony had been completed, the bonds sealed by tradition and law, yet the expected submission had not arrived. The Omega remained calm, poised, and strangely unyielding. The Alpha King watched her from the throne room as she moved among the servants and attendants. She carried herself with quiet grace, never rushing, never stumbling, never appearing afraid. And yet every motion, every tilt of her head seemed deliberate, measured. He could not read her fully, could not claim her entirely, not with words, not with gestures, not with the authority he had wielded over centuries. He rose and descended the steps, each click of his boots echoing across the marble floor. The court fell silent. They knew the Alpha's moods, his tempers, his command. But now they sensed something different, something fragile, something dangerous. The Omega met his gaze, unflinching. And in that simple act, he felt the weight of centuries pressing against his chest. She was not just an Omega, she was a challenge, a question he could not answer. "You move well," he said softly, stopping a few paces from her. "For someone who belongs to me?" She inclined her head slightly, but not submissively. "I belong to no one." His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in fascination. No one had ever spoken like this to him. Most trembled, most whispered, most bowed. She did none of these things. "The bond will grow stronger with time," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. "Soon you will understand your place. And what if I do not?" Her voice was steady, calm, carrying neither fear nor defiance, only quiet certainty. He felt a pulse of something he could not name, interest, perhaps, or unease. Her words should have angered him, yet they stirred something entirely new. Days passed, and the castle settled into routine, though nothing truly settled within the Alpha King's mind. He found himself watching the Omega, noting the way she handled herself in the kitchens, the gardens, the library. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were precise, careful, yet unexpectedly sharp. She asked questions, never idle, probing, exploring the world he had built around her, and the walls he had built around himself. He tried to teach her the ways of the court, the subtleties of command, the rituals of power, but each lesson seemed to fall into a quiet space where neither of them fully knew its purpose. She listened always, but followed only when it suited her, never bending fully to his will. It was in these small interactions that he began to sense the faintest shift in the curse that bound him. It had always been a silent, unrelenting pressure, a shadow on his soul. But around her, it flickered, softened, weakened, almost imperceptibly. And with each passing day, he felt something he had long thought impossible: doubt. He could not allow himself to speak of it. To admit weakness was to invite chaos, both from within himself and from the court that watched every movement, every expression, every word. And yet every glance from her eyes, every subtle smile, every measured pause reminded him that power was not always absolute. One evening, the two of them were alone in the northern gardens, a hidden place where the frost lingered longer than elsewhere, and the moonlight painted the stone paths silver. The Alpha King moved silently along the gravel, his cloak brushing the frozen leaves. She was there, standing by the fountain, her hands folded before her, her breath visible in the cold night air. "You come here often," he said, stopping a few steps behind her. She did not turn immediately, letting him watch her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost lost in the night. "The world is too loud inside the castle. The gardens are the only place where the wind is not someone else's command." He studied her, noting the simplicity of her words, yet the weight behind them. There was more than defiance there. There was understanding, wisdom beyond her years, and he realized with a sharp pang that the Omega had seen more of the world than he had allowed himself to feel in decades. "Do you understand what it means to be bound to me?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper against the frozen night. "I understand what it is to be bound," she replied, "but I do not understand why one must lose themselves to it." The Alpha King felt a tightening in his chest. He had never heard such words, never spoken with someone who did not fear him, and yet in her calm defiance he felt a pull he could not resist. "You are mine," he said more firmly this time, though the words felt hollow even to him. She turned her gaze toward him fully then, her eyes meeting his in a quiet storm of emotions. "No," she said, "not yours, never yours, not even when the world says I am." He took a step closer, drawn by something he could neither define nor resist. He wanted to command, to assert, to bend her will as he had done countless others. But he could not. Every motion, every breath, every heartbeat reminded him that she was not like the others. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft trickle of water from the fountain. And then she did something unexpected. She stepped closer, not in submission, but in proximity. The warmth of her presence brushed against him, soft, unyielding, and daring. He could feel her courage, her self-possession, and the unspoken knowledge she carried. "Why do you not fear me?" he asked finally, his voice rougher than intended. "Because fear is a choice," she said, "and I choose not to make it yours." That night the Alpha King could not sleep. He walked the corridors of his castle, hearing the echoes of the past, the whispers of rulers long gone, of Omgans who had cried, of kings who had ruled with an iron hand. And yet none of them had been like her. None had commanded a piece of him without even trying. He stopped at the chamber where she slept, or rather, where she rested, calm and composed as if the castle itself could not touch her. He studied her through the shadows, noting the faint rise and fall of her chest, the quiet serenity in her features. For the first time, he wondered if the curse that had defined him for centuries was not unbreakable. Perhaps it could be softened, even healed, by something he had never expected: trust, connection, the presence of someone willing to face him not as a god, not as a monster, but as a man. And yet the danger remained. He could see it buried in her strength. The bond was not simple. The curse would not yield without cost. And as much as he was drawn to her, he knew that the closer he came, the more fragile she would become. He remembered the moment before the ceremony, the moment she pressed her forehead to his chest. That simple act had shaken something ancient within him. Now, days later, it haunted him. He could feel the pull of her presence in every part of him, tugging at the walls he had built around his heart. The Alpha King knew that the court would never forgive weakness. The laws of power were absolute. Yet, in the silent corridors of his mind, in the quiet chambers of his soul, he found himself imagining a world where she did not fear him, where he did not rule through intimidation, where the curse that had defined him for centuries could be broken not by force, but by something far more elusive: balance. The next day, the bond began to reveal its subtle power. In the council chambers, the Alpha King observed her interacting with the nobles. She did not bend to fear, but she did not provoke. She spoke only when necessary, her words precise and measured, and yet they carried a quiet authority. He realized with a mixture of awe and dread that she was teaching him something he had forgotten long ago: restraint, compassion, observation. He had spent centuries ruling through strength and fear, never understanding that power could also reside in patience and understanding. And with each passing hour, he felt the curse's grip loosen, not gone, not broken, but tempered. Her calm presence acted as a counterweight, a silent force that both challenged and healed him. But the court noticed the change. Whispers began to circulate. The Alpha King was no longer untouchable. The Omega was no longer silent. And in the shadows, eyes watched, waiting for a misstep, waiting for the moment when the bond would falter. As night fell again, the Alpha King found himself walking toward the gardens, the same moonlight casting silver shadows on the paths. She was there waiting as if she had expected him. "You are changing," she said quietly, her voice carrying the soft echo of understanding and challenge. "You have changed me," he admitted, his voice low, almost reverent. "Then perhaps we are teaching each other," she said, and for the first time a faint smile touched her lips. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of storms yet to come. And as he stood there watching her, the Alpha King realized the truth. The bond was no longer just law. It was a living force between them, fragile yet undeniable, dangerous yet essential. The Omega had not bowed, she had not submitted. And in doing so, she had awakened something ancient within him, a force he had long thought lost, a part of himself that had been buried beneath centuries of command. He knew that the days ahead would test them both. The curse would demand, the court would watch, and the world would not forgive weakness. Yet, for the first time, he did not feel fear, not for himself, only concern for her. And as they stood together in the moonlight, two figures bound by law, tradition, and something far older, the Alpha King understood that the game had only just begun, and that fate had chosen them both for something neither fully understood. The castle had grown colder over the past weeks, though the season remained early winter. Frost edged the window panes, and the wind carried the scent of pine and distant mountains. Inside, the walls seemed to whisper of shadows long past, secrets held in stone and silence. For the Alpha King, every corner of his castle felt alive with the weight of expectation. And now, with a new tension he could not control. The Omega had changed him in ways subtle yet undeniable. His curse, once a relentless pressure on his soul, had softened in her presence, though not disappeared. He had come to value her calm, her defiance, her quiet understanding of the world he ruled. Yet the closer he came to her, the more fragile she seemed, as if the bond that gave him comfort was also draining her in ways he could not see. It began one morning with a message from the northern border. A group of nobles had gone missing, traveling to inspect the outer provinces. Some were found days later, returned silently, their faces pale with unspoken terror. The rumors that followed spoke of a shadow in the forests, an old force of the kingdom, thought long gone, now awakened. The Alpha King stood in the council chamber, his black cloak brushing the floor, his eyes sharper than any blade in the room. He listened as the nobles whispered fearfully, reporting sightings of a figure cloaked in darkness, moving faster than the wind, striking without warning. "It is impossible," he said, though his voice betrayed a flicker of unease. "All these lands are under my protection. Nothing should escape my sight." A shadow moved behind him. The Omega entered quietly, as she always did, observing the council without joining the discussion. She had grown stronger in the past weeks, adapting to the rituals of the court without losing herself. Yet tonight there was concern in her eyes. "The shadows do not respect your law," she said softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. "They follow the old rules, the forgotten pacts." He turned toward her, sensing the weight behind her words. She was not guessing. She had seen, understood, and perhaps even anticipated what he had yet to face. "Tell me," he said, his voice low. "What do you know?" She met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "The curse that binds you, it has roots older than your crown. And it seeks a balance. If it is not fulfilled, it will find a way to take what it needs from both of us." The Alpha King's heart tightened. He had long assumed that the curse was his burden alone, that he alone would bear its weight, and that no one else would be affected. Yet her words hinted at something far more dangerous. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. "It is not yours alone," she said. "It never was. It was created through betrayal long before you were born, and now it seeks to complete itself. We cannot escape it. We can only face it together." The weight of her words sank deep into him. For centuries he had believed himself untouchable, invincible, alone. And now he realized that the curse could not be defeated without both of them. His own power, his own dominance was no longer enough. That night, he sought her in the northern gardens again, the moonlight silvering the frost and casting long shadows across the stone paths. She stood by the fountain, her figure calm against the frozen landscape. He approached silently, his cloak whispering across the ground. "You warned me," he said, his voice carrying both accusation and wonder. "And yet I never understood the truth until now." She turned, her eyes reflecting the cold moonlight. "The truth is not yours to understand alone," she said. "It is ours to survive." He stepped closer, the frost crunching under his boots. "Then tell me, how do we survive it? How do we face a curse that has lasted generations, that cannot be broken by power or law?" "By trust," she replied, her voice calm, unwavering. "By facing it not as Alpha and Omega, but as equals. If you do not, it will destroy us both." He felt a shiver down his spine. Trust had always been foreign to him. He had commanded armies, ruled kingdoms, and bent people to his will. But trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability had always been weakness in his eyes. Yet standing here in the moonlight, watching her, he realized he had no choice. He could not face this alone. Days later, the first real test of that trust arrived. A messenger appeared at the castle gates, bearing a sealed letter with the insignia of the southern provinces. The seal was broken upon delivery, revealing a message written in haste. "The ancient shadow has returned," it read. "It moves toward the castle. The bond is not safe. Act before it is too late." The Alpha King felt a surge of anger and fear. He had ruled over fear for centuries, yet now it crept into his heart in ways he could not command. He summoned the council, the nobles, the guards, but even their presence brought little comfort. It was the Omega who spoke again, quietly yet firmly. "We cannot face this with armies alone. It is not a battle of strength, but of understanding. We must know the enemy before it knows us." He studied her, the weight of her words settling like snow in his chest. She was right, as always. He had relied on power his whole life, and it had never been enough. He had to see the world differently through her eyes if they were to survive. "Then we face it together," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Not as King and Omega, but as equals." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words. There was no submission in her gesture, only quiet acknowledgement. That night, as the castle slept under a moonlit sky, the Alpha King could not rest. He walked the corridors, restless, aware of shadows moving just beyond the walls. He stopped at the chamber where the Omega slept, or rather where she had placed herself in a quiet vigil. She had not bowed to fear, nor had she fled. She simply waited, prepared for what was coming. He entered silently, the faint smell of pine and candle smoke filling the air. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting calm determination. "You fear the bond," she said softly. "You fear the curse, and yet you care for me." He froze. No one had ever spoken such words to him, let alone challenged him so directly. "Care," he repeated, almost tasting the word. "I do not know what that means anymore." "It means you are human," she said simply. "Even kings are human, even cursed kings." The Alpha King felt something stir deep within him, a longing he had buried under centuries of command. For the first time, he realized that the curse was not only a chain, it was a mirror, reflecting his own fears, his own loneliness, his own heart. And for the first time, he saw that the Omega's strength was not in submission, but in survival, understanding, and quiet defiance. He took a step closer, and for a brief moment the world seemed to shrink around them. The castle walls, the frost, the shadows, they all disappeared. Only the two of them remained, bound by the weight of history, law, and the invisible threads of something far older. "Then we face it," he said finally, his voice firmer. "Together." She nodded, a faint smile touching her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "Together," she repeated. The following days brought their first confrontation with the shadow. Reports of strange movements in the forests intensified. Guards were attacked, messages intercepted, and travelers vanished. The castle trembled under the weight of unease, and even the bravest nobles whispered of old tales best left forgotten. The Alpha King and the Omega prepared. She studied the old maps, the ancient texts, and the hidden knowledge of the kingdom. He commanded the soldiers, but he also listened, learning from her in ways he had never learned from advisors. The bond between them strengthened, not through obedience, but through reliance. And yet the tension grew. Every glance, every brush of hands, every unspoken word reminded him of the fragility of their situation. He felt the curse stir, dark and insistent, warning that it would not yield easily. He could see it in her eyes, too, a shadow that matched his own, a silent understanding of the cost they might have to pay. The night before their planned confrontation, the Alpha King returned to the northern gardens. The frost shimmered under the silver light of the moon. She was there, waiting, as if she had always known he would come. "The curse is strong," he said quietly, his hands resting on the stone fountain. "Stronger than I thought." "It always was," she replied, calm and steady. "But so are we if we choose to be." He studied her, feeling the weight of the moment, the gravity of the bond they shared, and the danger that awaited. "And if we fail?" he asked, his voice low. "Then we face it," she said, meeting his gaze. "Together." For the first time in centuries, the Alpha King felt a flicker of something fragile yet undeniable: hope. The wind whispered through the frozen branches, carrying the scent of storms yet to come. And in that stillness, two hearts bound by law, curse, and choice prepared for the coming fracture, the moment when their strength, their trust, and their bond would be tested as never before. The castle trembled in the early hours of dawn. Snow swirled against the stone towers, whipping through the empty courtyards as if the wind itself were alive. The shadow the kingdom had feared for generations had arrived, relentless and unforgiving. Soldiers lined the walls, swords ready, hearts pounding. But the Alpha King knew the fight ahead would not be won by steel alone. He stood in the northern gardens, the frost glinting like shattered glass under the pale light of the moon fading into morning. Beside him, the Omega stood calm and poised, her breath visible in the icy air. She had spent days preparing, studying the ancient texts, the maps, the whispers of the curse. He had commanded armies, yet here he felt helpless. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, more vulnerable than he had ever allowed himself to be. "As ready as one can be," she said softly. Her gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "We face it together, always together." He nodded, swallowing the tension in his chest. The bond that had seemed so fragile, the connection that had drawn him out of centuries of solitude, now felt like the only anchor in a storm that threatened to consume everything. The first attack came suddenly. A cold darkness swept over the northern walls, moving faster than any shadow could, striking the soldiers with invisible hands. Screams echoed across the courtyard as men fell, frozen in fear, their bodies unmoving. But the Alpha King and the Omega did not falter. He raised his arms, commanding the soldiers, but also observing, feeling the pattern of the shadow's movements. The Omega's presence was a quiet counterbalance. She did not fight with brute force, but with understanding. Her hands traced the air as if reading invisible lines of power, whispering instructions to him, guiding him through the chaos. "It feeds on fear," she said. "Do not give it what it seeks." He focused, drawing on every lesson, every memory, every ounce of discipline he had mastered. The shadow struck again, and again, but each time he anticipated, each time he countered. And each time the Omega mirrored him, steady, unflinching, her calm a shield against the terror surrounding them. The wind howled, carrying the scent of pine, frost, and magic long forgotten. The Alpha King realized that the curse, the one that had defined his life, the one that had isolated him from all connection, was rising. But it was rising not to destroy him alone, but to challenge them both. "We must bind it," he said, voice steady but urgent. "Together." She nodded, "Trust me." They moved in tandem, weaving through the chaos of the attack. Soldiers fell around them, yet they pressed forward, guided by a rhythm only they could feel. The shadow had a presence, a consciousness, but it was not invincible. It responded to hesitation, to fear, to weakness. And in the Alpha King and the Omega, it faced neither. The closer they moved to the heart of the castle, the stronger the shadow became. It lashed out with sudden gusts of freezing wind, whipping snow and shards of ice, trying to force them apart. He could feel it in his bones, the curse that had followed him, the shadow that had waited centuries for completion. It was testing them, probing for weakness. And yet the Omega did not falter. She held his hand for a moment, a brief contact that conveyed more than words ever could. It anchored him, reminded him that the bond was not of command, but of choice. "Now," she whispered. "Now together." He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, focusing on her presence, on the pulse of the bond, on the strength that came not from dominance, but from unity. He let go of the instinct to control, to command, to conquer. And in that moment, the shadow faltered. The final confrontation took place in the castle's central hall, a space adorned with ancient tapestries depicting rulers, warriors, and forgotten pacts. The shadow condensed, a dark, swirling mass of fear and memory, its edges sharp with ice and shadow. It loomed over them, a living force of centuries of betrayal and pain. The Alpha King stepped forward, his hand brushing the Omega's. He had never felt more vulnerable, yet never more alive. The curse rose around them like a storm, but he did not resist it with strength alone. He resisted it with trust, with connection, with surrender. "Together," he said, his voice echoing against the stone walls. She mirrored him, their hands entwined, their breaths synchronized. "Together!" The shadow struck, lashing with force that could have crushed them. But the bond between them held firm. The Omega's calm acted as a counterbalance, the Alpha King's focus a shield. They met the curse not as predator and prey, not as ruler and servant, but as equals. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the shadow began to weaken. It recoiled from their unity, from the trust they shared, from the surrender neither had known they possessed. It shrieked in silence, a sound that echoed in the corners of the mind, testing, probing, seeking a weakness it could not find. The Alpha King stepped closer to the center of the hall. "It will not break," he whispered almost to himself. "It will," she said. Her voice carried a quiet authority that belied her youth, her calm defiance striking like a beacon in the darkness. "We must give it what it needs." Not dominance, not power, but balance. He understood instantly. The curse did not demand control, it demanded choice. It thrived on fear, on submission, on separation. And now it was time to give it none of those things. They closed their eyes, letting the bond guide them. The Alpha King felt centuries of pain, loneliness, and isolation lift slightly, replaced by the warmth of connection. The Omega felt the echo of the curse in her own veins, but also the strength of their unity. Together they focused not on what the curse could take, but on what it could not touch. Their mutual trust, their shared courage, their willingness to face it together. The shadow shrieked and swirled, but with each moment it faltered. The curse, the darkness, the ancient force. It began to dissolve, its edges softening, its power waning. And then with a final, silent exhale, it shattered, leaving only silence, only stillness, only the warmth of two hearts standing together in the quiet aftermath. When the dust of shadow cleared, the Alpha King fell to one knee, exhausted but alive. The Omega knelt beside him, her hand steady in his. For the first time in centuries, he felt truly free, not from rule, not from expectation, but from the curse that had bound him more tightly than chains ever could. He looked at her, eyes searching, words caught in his throat. I did not know it could end like this," he whispered. "Neither did I," she replied softly, "but we faced it together." He reached for her face, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. She did not flinch, she did not retreat. She met his gaze fully, calmly, and with a quiet certainty that shook him. "You were right," he said, his voice low and reverent. "It was never about power alone, it was about connection, about trust." She smiled faintly, a warmth that reached her eyes. "And you learned that in time." The castle was quiet now, the storm past, the shadow gone. Soldiers looked on, awe and relief etched across their faces. The nobles whispered, amazed that the Alpha King, the ruler of all, had faced a force no one else could comprehend, and survived. But none of them understood the truth. Survival had not come from fear or strength or command. It had come from the bond, from the quiet courage of the Omega, from the trust they had chosen to give each other. The Alpha King rose, stronger now not only in body but in spirit. He did not feel untouchable. He did not feel unbroken. He felt human. Vulnerable, yes, but alive, and for the first time in centuries, capable of love without fear, without domination, without shadow. He took the Omega's hand in his, holding it gently, reverently. "This time," he said, his voice carrying a rare softness, "will you kiss me?" She met his gaze, the faintest flicker of laughter in her eyes. "This time I will." And she did. The kiss was not an act of submission, it was a promise, a bond reaffirmed, a choice made freely without fear or obligation. It sealed not only their victory over the curse, but the beginning of something new, a life shaped not by law, by fear, or by darkness, but by trust, equality, and love. The kingdom itself seemed to change after that day. The shadow that had haunted generations was gone, the curse broken not by force, but by understanding. The Alpha King ruled not with terror, but with wisdom tempered by empathy. The Omega, once quiet and wary, became a force in her own right, respected, strong, and always standing beside him. And when they walked through the halls of the castle together, hand in hand, there was no trace of the fear that had defined them. Only the quiet, enduring strength of two hearts that had faced centuries of darkness and emerged whole. The wind whispered through the towers, the snow glistened in the sunlight, and the castle, long a place of shadows and silence, breathed with new life. The Alpha King and the Omega had faced the impossible, and they had won, not through domination, not through force, but through trust, courage, and the unbreakable bond they had chosen together. And for the first time in centuries, they knew that true power did not lie in fear, nor in chains, nor in curses. True power lay in surrendering together, standing together, and loving together.